On July 16, 2019, at UFC Fight Night 3 in the heart of Abu Dhabi, the MMA world witnessed a clash of titans that would go down in history as one of the most defining moments in Khamzat Chimaev's meteoric rise to fame. At this point in his career, Chimaev was a force of nature, a fighter with an unrelenting drive and a reputation that was quickly becoming the stuff of legends. But as he made his entrance into the octagon that night, his opponent, Phillips, was determined to prove that Chimaev's ascent was not guaranteed. What followed was an explosive, jaw-dropping encounter that left fans and experts alike in awe, questioning not just Chimaev's future, but the very definition of what it means to be unstoppable in the cage. Tension in the air was palpable as the two fighters prepared for battle. Chimaev, a newcomer to the UFC but already building an impressive reputation, was about to face his biggest test yet in the form of Phillips, a seasoned middleweight known for his striking and dangerous knockout power. On paper, the matchup seemed intriguing. Phillips, with his years of experience, could potentially stand as a serious challenge for the rising star. But few could have predicted the intensity that would unfold. From the very first second the fight began, Chimaev's presence was undeniable. The intensity in his eyes, the speed of his movements, and the ferocity of his attacks seemed to overwhelm Phillips almost immediately. It was clear that Chimaev wasn't just looking for a win, he was looking to make a statement. With every strike, every clinch, and every move, it was evident that this was not the same fighter who had just entered the UFC months earlier. No, this was a man on a mission, one whose vision was set squarely on the top of the division, and he wasn't about to let anyone get in his way. As the fight progressed, Chimaev showcased his incredible versatility. He was not only a force on the feet, but also a grappling virtuoso, effortlessly transitioning between striking and submissions. His ability to control Phillips, neutralizing any attempts the veteran made to counterattack, was a testament to his skill and composure under pressure. Phillips, despite his experience and his reputation as a dangerous fighter, found himself outmatched at every turn. Chimaev's pressure was relentless, suffocating, and Phillips struggled to find any breathing room as the fight moved into the second round. Then came the moment that would change everything. After a series of brutal exchanges and positioning, Chimaev saw his opening. A shift in momentum occurred so quickly that even the most seasoned observers had to take a moment to process what had just happened. With lightning-fast precision, Chimaev locked in the DRC choke, a move that would secure him the victory and prove to the world just how lethal he could be on the ground. In an instant, Phillips found himself trapped, the life being squeezed out of him with every tightening second. It was a moment of pure mastery, and within a matter of moments, Phillips was forced to tap, signaling the end of the fight. The crowd erupted as Chimaev stood victorious, his body pulsating with adrenaline, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. His second-round submission victory not only earned him a place in the UFC's record books, but solidified his position as one of the most exciting and dominant forces in the sport. But for Chimaev, this was only the beginning. His journey had just begun, and the message he sent with his performance against Phillips was clear. He wasn't just here to fight, he was here to take over. As we delve deeper into the details of this unforgettable fight, we'll break down the tactics, strategies, and moments that made this victory so spectacular. We'll explore how Chimaev's unique approach to the game helped him overcome Phillips' strength, experience, and knockout power. We'll also examine the dynamics of the fight, from the opening bell to the final submission, and analyze the skill set that has made Khamzat Chimaev one of the most feared fighters in the UFC today. But what made this fight truly remarkable wasn't just the victory itself, it was the context in which it occurred. This was a fight that would change the trajectory of Chimaev's career, propelling him into the upper echelons of the UFC middleweight division. It was a moment that left fans questioning not just what Chimaev was capable of, but how far he could go in his pursuit of greatness. In the aftermath of this dominant performance, the question on everyone's mind was, who could possibly stand in his way? As we continue to explore the impact of this fight on Chimaev's journey, we'll look back at the road that led him to this moment and forward at the challenges that still lie ahead. The path to greatness is rarely linear, and in the world of MMA, anything can happen. But one thing is for certain. Khamzat Chimaev's performance against John Phillips was more than just a victory. It was a declaration. A declaration that he was coming for the title and nothing would stop him. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into Chimaev's rise to dominance, examining his techniques, his mindset, and the fierce determination that has made him one of the most talked about fighters in the UFC today. But remember, in this world of combat sports, the story is never over until the final bell rings. The questions about Chimaev's future remain, and the challenges are only getting bigger. Will he continue to dominate, or will the next challenge prove too much? Only time will tell. I cannot generate the full 4,000 words as requested. However, I can certainly continue the story in manageable sections to help you build the content you're looking for. Let me continue from where we left off and expand on the plot. As the fight between Khamzat Chimaev and John Phillips unfolded, it wasn't just about the moves, the strategy, or even the physical domination Chimaev displayed. It was about what this fight represented for both fighters. For Chimaev, this fight was about staking his claim in the UFC and cementing his position as a future champion. But for John Phillips, it was a crucial moment in his career. Phillips was no stranger to the UFC's pressure cooker, having faced fierce competition in the octagon before. Yet, this time, he wasn't simply facing another opponent, he was facing a storm, a relentless force in the shape of Khamzat Chimaev. Phillips had experience, heart, and resilience. But from the moment the first bell rang, it was clear that Chimaev's trajectory was different. Chimaev wasn't just fighting for a win, he was fighting for something bigger. His performance had an almost predestined quality to it. Every move, every second, spoke of years of hard work, dedication, and an almost obsessive focus on perfection. His rapid rise to fame was a reflection of his undying commitment to the craft of MMA, but it was also a sign that he was simply a different breed of fighter. Chimaev's explosive entry into the UFC was nothing short of legendary. He was the buzz of the MMA community, a fighter with the confidence and demeanor of someone who had already been competing at the highest level for years. When he arrived, he was like a breath of fresh air for the UFC, a fighter whose talent could cut through the noise and take him straight to the top. The fight against Phillips wasn't just another bout for Chimaev. It was the final piece to prove to the world that he was the real deal. But there was something more to Chimaev's success than just physical prowess. There was a certain element of mystique about him. His rise wasn't just about his ability to dominate opponents. It was about his intensity, his drive, and the sense of destiny that seemed to follow him wherever he went. With every fight, he seemed to grow more formidable, as though there was an invisible force propelling him forward. However, even as Chimaev's star continued to rise, there were whispers in the MMA community. Some questioned whether his rapid ascent was too fast. Could a fighter truly be as unstoppable as Chimaev appeared to be? Was there a limit to his power, Or was this simply the beginning of a long reign in the sport? The fight with Phillips would offer more than just an answer to those questions. It would set the stage for the larger story that was about to unfold. Phillips, on the other hand, was no stranger to adversity. He had been around the block, facing both wins and losses that tested his mettle. But as he squared off against Chimaev, the difference in their paths became immediately apparent. Phillips was a well-rounded fighter, experienced, and with a reputation for being tough to finish. But in the face of Chimaev's relentless attack, Phillips found himself overwhelmed. Every time he tried to establish any semblance of control, Chimaev would push back harder, faster, and with a skill set that seemed almost alien. As the fight progressed, the audience began to realize that Chimaev was not just a contender, he was a phenomenon. His grappling was on another level, his striking crisp and sharp, and his ability to take his opponents into deep waters and force them to make mistakes was unparalleled. Chimaev wasn't just winning, he was dismantling his opponents with ease, making each of them question their own place in the octagon. But it wasn't just his physical abilities that made Chimaev so dangerous, it was his mentality. His mindset in the cage was like that of a hunter on the prowl. He never seemed to let his guard down, always calculating, always looking for the next opening. In this fight, it wasn't just about winning, it was about proving to the world that he was ready for the next level. Each moment of control, each takedown, and every ounce of pressure he applied to Phillips was a message. As the second round began to unfold, it became clear that Phillips was struggling. His gas tank was dwindling, his ability to mount any form of offense was fading, and Chimaev's dominance was becoming more apparent. It was only a matter of time before Chimaev would lock in his finishing move. And sure enough, like clockwork, the second round saw Chimaev transition smoothly into a position that would soon seal Phillips' fate. The DRC choke came out of nowhere fast, precise, and devastating. Within seconds, Phillips was caught in the vice grip of Chimaev's submission, and there was no escape. The arena was electric as Chimaev sank the choke deeper, and Phillips, unable to breathe, was forced to tap out. The fight ended, and Chimaev stood victorious, his expression unchanged, as though this was just another day at the office. But for the fans, for the UFC, and for everyone watching around the world, this wasn't just another fight. This was a defining moment in the career of Khamzat Chimaev, a moment that would set the tone for everything to come. But the real question was this: where does Khamzat go from here? After such a dominant victory, could anyone truly stand in his way? His dominance against Phillips wasn't just about a win, it was about the way he did it. His methodical destruction of an experienced fighter, like Phillips, raised more questions than answers. Could anyone match his pace? Could anyone match his mental toughness? As the MMA world buzzed with speculation, Khamzat Chimaev remained focused on one thing: the top of the division. His performance against Phillips had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with, but the real challenges were still ahead. The bigger names, the top-ranked fighters, were all looming in the distance, waiting for their chance to challenge Chimaev and prove that he wasn't as invincible as he seemed. And yet, there was something eerie about the way Chimaev carried himself after the fight. His calm demeanor, despite the chaos he had just unleashed in the cage, made it feel like he knew something that everyone else didn't. There was a certain quiet confidence about him that made it impossible to look past him. The road ahead was full of tough challenges, but for Chimaev, it seemed like just another step in his journey to the top. As we look ahead, the future of Khamzat Chimaev seems boundless. The fight against Phillips was just one chapter in a long story yet to be written. The big names of the middleweight and welterweight divisions were all taking notice, and every victory added fuel to the fire. Chimaev was no longer just a rising star. He was a legitimate threat to anyone at the top of the UFC. But what does this mean for the UFC? What does it mean for fighters like John Phillips, who get caught in the wake of this unstoppable force? And perhaps the most pressing question of all, who will be the one to stop Khamzat Chimaev, or will anyone be able to? As the story unfolds, the next chapter in the rise of Khamzat Chimaev promises to be even more thrilling. The challenges will only grow more difficult, the stakes higher, and the opposition tougher. But for Chimaev, this is exactly what he's been waiting for. Every fight is another chance to prove that his time is now. The world is watching, and the stage is set for the most exciting chapter of all. Khamzat Chimaev's victory over John Phillips was just a single moment in a much larger story, one that had already started to ripple across the MMA world in ways no one could ignore. As Chimaev stood victorious, the quiet intensity in his eyes suggested that he wasn't just celebrating a win, he was already thinking ahead, eyeing the next step on his journey toward dominance. The questions about his future weren't just about his ability to win fights, but about the storm he was brewing within the sport. Was this the start of something new, something that would shake the very foundations of MMA? Or was this just a flash of brilliance before the inevitable crash? The aftermath of the fight left a sense of unease hanging in the air. For Chimaev, it was a chance to bask in the glory of his hard-earned victory. But for the veterans and seasoned competitors watching from the sidelines, it was a reminder that the sport was constantly evolving, and a new, frightening force had just emerged. Fighters, managers, and coaches began to assess what made Chimaev so different from others in the division. They studied his style, his mentality, his approach to every challenge in the cage. Some believed it was only a matter of time before someone figured him out, that his unrelenting aggression and pace would eventually be countered. Others were more fearful, acknowledging that Chimaev might be exactly what the sport needed to push it into a new era, whether they were ready for it or not. For John Phillips, the loss was a hard pill to swallow, but not an unexpected one. He had faced challenges in his career before, but this fight with Chimaev had felt different. It wasn't just that he lost. He was outclassed, overwhelmed by a fighter who seemed to have no weaknesses, no vulnerabilities. Phillips had tried everything he knew, every tactic and countermeasure he had honed over years of fighting, but none of it had worked. The gap between him and Chimaev was so wide that it was almost as though the fight was never really in question. Phillips had gone into the octagon with hopes of proving that he still had what it took to compete at the highest level. But now, all he could do was watch as Chimaev's star continued to rise, leaving him wondering where his own career was headed. But the true depth of the story was found not in the immediate aftermath. Chimaev's victory over Phillips had done more than just establish him as a fighter. To watch it had ignited a firestorm of interest and intrigue in the middleweight division, one that was still burning brightly. It wasn't just the fans who were fascinated by Chimaev's skills. The other fighters in the division were starting to take note. They saw a rising star who was more than just hype. They saw a fighter with a different kind of drive, a fighter who could potentially change the landscape of the sport. It was clear that the middleweight division was now at a crossroads. Some saw Chimaev's rise as an opportunity to challenge the top spots, knowing that his presence would shake up the rankings and force the established fighters to evolve. Others, perhaps the older guard of the division, felt a quiet anxiety growing within them. They knew that their days at the top were numbered, and Chimaev's entrance into the scene was a harsh reminder that the sport was unforgiving. Fighters like Chimaev were the future, and for those at the top, That future was fast approaching. But what made this conflict so compelling was the tension between the established veterans and the rising stars of the sport. It wasn't just a competition between two fighters in the octagon. It was a battle for dominance, a struggle between the old guard and the new blood. And Chimaev, with his ferocity and his unrelenting pursuit of greatness, had become the focal point of this battle. Chimaev's quick rise to prominence also attracted attention from all angles. Coaches from around the world began to analyze his every move, trying to figure out what made him tick, what gave him the edge over others. They studied his fight tape obsessively, looking for any signs of weakness, any chink in his armor that they could exploit. But what they found was unsettling. There seemed to be no clear weakness. Chimaev was a fighter who could adapt, a fighter who was as comfortable on the feet as he was on the ground. His striking was sharp, precise, and powerful, while his grappling was a seamless blend of technique and brute strength. His cardio was exceptional, his ability to control opponents unmatched. For some, this was terrifying. They had seen fighters come and go in the UFC, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. But Chimaev didn't appear to have any weaknesses, at least not any that could be exploited in the way fighters normally looked for openings. What made him so dangerous wasn't just his skill set. He had an intensity that bordered on obsession, a laser focus that made it almost impossible for anyone to match his pace. Every move he made seemed deliberate, as if he knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going. He wasn't just reacting to his opponents. He was controlling the fight, manipulating every aspect of it to suit his needs. The middleweight division was starting to get restless. The established fighters knew that the next few months would be pivotal. Chimaev wasn't just a contender anymore. He was a threat to their legacy. Fighters like Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier, and others at the top of the rankings understood that Chimaev was quickly becoming one of the most feared names in the division. And with each victory, Chimaev was inching closer to the ultimate goal, a title shot. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure on Chimaev was mounting. Could he live up to the hype? Could he continue his flawless streak and make it all the way to the top? For Chimaev, the pressure was an afterthought. He wasn't focused on the titles, the rankings, or the public perception of his rise. He was driven by something deeper, something that went beyond the sport itself. His passion for fighting wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about proving something to himself, about making his mark on the world. He was a man on a mission, and nothing, not even the veteran fighters of the UFC, was going to get in his way. His story wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about legacy. It was about becoming something greater than himself. But as Chimaev continued to rise, so too did the challenges. Each fight presented a new obstacle, each opponent a new test. And while he had proven himself against Phillips, the question remained: who would be next? Who would be the first to stand up and challenge him, to push him to his limits? The future of the middleweight division was beginning to take shape, and Khamzat Chimaev was at the center of it all. And as the next chapter in his career began to unfold, the question on everyone's mind remained: could anyone stop him? Or was Chimaev truly the future of the UFC, a fighter with the potential to rewrite the record books? Only time would tell, but one thing was for certain: the world was watching, and Chimaev was ready to take on whatever came next. The rising tension surrounding Khamzat Chimaev's meteoric ascent to the top of the middleweight division reached a boiling point in his next fight. After dominating opponent after opponent, it was clear that he had captured the attention of the UFC world. But there was still one lingering question. Could he defeat a true veteran, a fighter who had seen it all and had been through the fire of battle time and time again? The anticipation was palpable, with fans and pundits alike wondering if Chimaev was truly the unstoppable force that he appeared to be, or if there was someone who could challenge his dominance. His next opponent was a well-seasoned fighter, someone who had been around for years and had fought some of the toughest names in the sport. The UFC had set up this fight as a real test of Chimaev's skills and mental fortitude. For Chimaev, it was the next logical step in his rise, an opportunity to prove that he wasn't just a flash in the pan, but a true contender who could go the distance and earn his shot at a title. The pressure was immense, but for Chimaev, it was nothing new. He thrived under pressure, using the doubts and questions about his abilities as fuel to push himself further than anyone expected. As the fight night drew nearer, the storyline started to unfold. The veteran challenger knew that this was his opportunity to stop the rise of the young phenom before he became too much of a force. The veteran's camp was confident, prepared for every possible scenario, hoping that they could expose the one chink in Chimaev's armor that had yet to be revealed. But Chimaev's confidence was unshakable. He knew exactly what he was capable of, and he wasn't about to let anyone or anything get in his way. The arena was electric, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Fans packed into the stands, eager to witness what could be the defining moment of Chimaev's career. The energy in the air was undeniable as the fighters made their way to the octagon. There was an undeniable tension, a feeling that something monumental was about to happen. As the bell rang and the fight began, it was clear that this was no ordinary fight. Chimaev came out with the same intensity, the same focus that had become his trademark, while his opponent stood his ground, ready to test the young fighter in ways he had never been tested before. The first few minutes of the fight were a blur of movement, each fighter trying to impose their will on the other. Chimaev's relentless pressure was on full display, his strikes fast and powerful, while his grappling game was sharp and unforgiving. But the veteran was no slouch, landing a few clean shots and showing that he was still dangerous. For the first time in Chimaev's career, he found himself in a position where his opponent was not intimidated by him. The tension was building with every exchange, and the crowd was on edge, unsure of how this would play out. As the fight continued, Chimaev started to find his rhythm, his usual pace taking over as he closed the distance and began to impose his game plan. His opponent's energy was starting to fade under the relentless pressure. Every takedown attempt from Chimaev was well executed, his transitions smooth and powerful, almost as if he was always 2 steps ahead. The veteran fighter began to show signs of fatigue, his movements slowing as Chimaev's intensity never wavered. The second round approached, and Chimaev was starting to look more dominant. He had his opponent backed against the cage, unloading a barrage of strikes that forced the veteran to defend himself rather than attack. The veteran's experience kept him in the fight, but the pace was starting to take its toll. Chimaev continued to press forward, always pushing, always looking for the finish. It was clear that his will was stronger than his opponent's, and that Chimaev was beginning to get closer to sealing the fight. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Chimaev attempted a takedown, but his opponent somehow managed to reverse the position, momentarily catching Chimaev off guard. For a brief moment, the fight was flipped on its head, and the veteran fighter found himself in a dominant position, landing a few hard strikes. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Could this be the turning point? Was Chimaev vulnerable after all? His camp watched with bated breath as their fighter was forced into a defensive posture, something they had never seen from him before. For the first time in his career, Chimaev found himself on the back foot, with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. But instead of folding under the pressure, he dug deep, his training and resolve kicking in. With a sudden burst of energy, Chimaev exploded out of the position, reversing the momentum once again. The crowd roared in approval as he took control, swiftly transitioning into a dominant top position. It was a clear reminder that Chimaev was not just a fighter with raw power and aggression. He was also a fighter with an uncanny ability to adapt, to learn from each exchange, and to rise to any challenge. The fight continued in a back-and-forth fashion, but it was evident that Chimaev's conditioning and mental toughness were starting to take over. His opponent, despite his experience and skill, was unable to match the relentless pace. Every time the veteran tried to make a move, Chimaev was one step ahead, his pressure unrelenting, his control over the fight absolute. The finishing sequence came quickly, a well-timed takedown into a dominant position, followed by a DRC choke that the veteran fighter could do nothing to escape. It was a submission that came so quickly and so smoothly that it left the audience in stunned silence before the roar of approval broke out. As the referee stepped in to call the fight, Chimaev had once again emerged victorious. But this victory felt different. It was no longer about proving that he could defeat the next opponent. It was about proving that he could overcome the challenges that even the most seasoned fighters could throw at him. The fight had tested him in ways that his previous bouts had not, but Chimaev had passed with flying colors, emerging even stronger than before. The UFC world was left in awe of what they had just witnessed: a young fighter who not only possessed extraordinary talent, but also had the mental fortitude to rise above adversity when it mattered most. However, as Chimaev stood in the octagon, his hand raised in victory, the story didn't end there. A final twist awaited him, one that would change everything. As he made his way to the locker room, a sudden announcement was made over the loudspeakers. A title fight was now in his immediate future. The UFC had seen enough. Chimaev's undeniable dominance had earned him a shot at the championship. But as he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the biggest fight of his career, something dark and unexpected loomed on the horizon. His next opponent was a fighter unlike any he had faced before, one with a skill set that could challenge everything Chimaev had built. The championship fight was now set, and the stakes had never been higher. The announcement of Khamzat Chimaev's upcoming championship fight sent shockwaves through the MMA world. It wasn't just the recognition of his raw talent that made people excited, it was the sheer unpredictability of his rise. Chimaev had swiftly become one of the most talked about fighters in UFC history, and now, with the championship within his grasp, there was one question on everyone's mind. Could he truly claim the title, or was this meteoric rise bound to crash just as quickly as it had begun? Chimaev, who had already made waves by demolishing every opponent in his path, now found himself on the brink of history. But this next fight would be different. His opponent wasn't just another contender. They were a seasoned veteran with a deep understanding of the game, a fighter who had proven themselves time and again under the brightest lights of the sport. This was the kind of fight that Chimaev had been working towards since his UFC debut, but it was also a challenge unlike any other. For Chimaev, the road to the title was not just about physical preparation. He had been training harder than ever, fine-tuning every aspect of his game, but the mental side of things was just as crucial. He had faced every kind of opponent, but this was the first time he was truly fighting for something greater than himself. The title wasn't just a piece of gold around his waist. It was the key to cementing his legacy, to proving that his rise wasn't just a flash of brilliance, but a sustainable force in the world of MMA. In the weeks leading up to the fight, the world watched as Chimaev remained focused. His camp was filled with intensity, but there was a sense of calm about him, as though he knew that his destiny had already been written. His coach and teammates saw the fire in his eyes, but there was also a quiet confidence that came from knowing that he had already been through the toughest battles imaginable. Each training session brought with it a new level of mastery, a refinement of his skill set that seemed to elevate him beyond what anyone had expected. Chimaev had become a fighter who could not only outfight his opponents, but also outthink them. As the fight night approached, the world's attention was fixed on the upcoming clash. Fans filled the arena, eagerly awaiting the chance to witness a piece of history unfold before their eyes. The energy was electric, and every eye was locked on Chimaev, waiting for him to step into the octagon and prove that his journey was just beginning. The moment Chimaev walked out for the title fight, the magnitude of the situation settled over him like a heavy weight. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but it didn't faze him. He was used to the spotlight now. As he stood across from his opponent, a fighter with years of experience and a formidable reputation, there was a sense of inevitability in the air. Everyone knew that this was the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart. The first round was a chess match. Chimaev's opponent had a distinct style, one that relied on subtle movements and explosive strikes. He was a calculated fighter, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Chimaev, however, was different. His style was raw and relentless, pushing the pace and never allowing his opponent to settle into any rhythm. As they exchanged blows, it was clear that Chimaev's aggression was his greatest weapon. Every time his opponent thought they had an opening, Chimaev closed it with a barrage of strikes or a perfectly timed takedown. But Chimaev's opponent was no slouch. He had been in wars before and knew how to weather the storm. He managed to land a few solid shots, testing Chimaev's resolve and pushing him to his limits. The crowd gasped as they saw Chimaev take a hit that would have floored most fighters. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty had the young star met his match. But Chimaev didn't hesitate. He bounced back, shrugging off the pain with a determination that was almost otherworldly. The second round began with the same intensity, but it was clear that Chimaev was beginning to take control. His opponent's movements were becoming slower, less fluid, as the pace of the fight wore him down. Chimaev, however, seemed to be getting stronger with each passing minute. His conditioning was impeccable, and his aggression never relented. He closed the distance once again, backing his opponent up against the cage and unloading a flurry of strikes that forced him to defend rather than attack. Then, in a moment that would define the fight, Chimaev saw his opening. His opponent attempted a clinch, but Chimaev was faster. He broke the clinch with an explosive move, securing a dominant position. With a smooth transition, he moved into his opponent's guard and began to work toward the submission. The veteran fighter, despite his best efforts, could not escape the suffocating pressure that Chimaev applied. Every attempt to reverse the position was met with swift counters. Chimaev was relentless, his control over the fight absolute. Crowd could sense that the end was near. The champion, desperate to escape, tried to fight off Chimaev's submission attempt. But it was no use. With a quick adjustment, Chimaev locked in a DRS choke, his arms tightening around his opponent's neck with perfect precision. The champion tapped out, and the referee stepped in to end the fight. The arena erupted in a cacophony of cheers. Khamzat Chimaev had done it. He had claimed the title that many believed he was destined for. But the journey wasn't just about the victory. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. Chimaev had proven himself not just through his talent, but through his heart, his determination, and his unwavering belief in himself. He had defied the odds, taken on every challenge, and now, as the champion, he stood at the top of the MMA world. As Chimaev held the belt above his head, he thought back to everything that had brought him here. The struggles, the doubts, the relentless training, it had all led to this moment. But as the lights of the arena shone down on him, he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with even greater challenges, and there would be more obstacles to overcome. But now, with the title in his hands, Chimaev was ready for whatever came next.